Dear students at Al-Azhar University, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In this video, we will move to another question regarding the international humanitarian law. And the question today is about the jurisdiction ratione persona, or the personal jurisdiction of the IHL, or who are the persons that are protected under the IHL, or in other words, whom does IHL protect? Actually, we shall start with the fact that the categories of protected persons under IHL vary according to their nature, whether they are a combatant ones or even a civilian ones. And we will differentiate between the two kinds of the armed conflicts, since the categories of persons vary according to the classification of the armed conflict, whether it is of an international character or non-international one. And we will start by talking about the first category of international armed conflicts, or the armed conflicts, which is the international one, or the IX. Under IX, there are two main kinds of persons who are protected under the IHL. The first one is the civilians, and the second one the combatants, who are not civilians because they take part in hostilities. And they are mainly designed to take part in hostilities. Actually, regarding the civilian ones, civilians are entitled with two kinds of protection. Actually, there is something called the general protection, and it means that the civilian ones they enjoy general protection against the dangers arising from hostilities, and we will discuss this in more details in question number 11 of this booklet. But you have to know here that the civilians have and enjoy the general protection of IHL against any kind of dangers that are arising from the hostilities, the international armed conflict. Who is the civilians? For these purposes, the civilians are defined as all persons who are not combatant, anyone who is not combatant, who is not designed to take part in hostility, and anyone who do not take part in hostility by being a civilian person. So these civilians, as defined here, must not be the object of the attacks. The only exception to this rule is that when they take up arms against the enemy, then in this case they will lose their protection under the IHL, and they can be legitimate target under IHL. So they may be targeted if they take up arms against the enemy, and they may be targeted only when they are directly participate in hostilities, and we will also discuss what do we mean by the direct participate in hostilities according to the ICRC the publications, and also we will discuss this later in more details in question number 11 of this booklet. Anyway, civilians are the first persons who are protected under IHL in times of the international armed conflict. And we know now who is the civilian. The civilian is a person who is not combatant. This is in a nutshell. So they have a general protection against any act of hostilities, and also they have a specific protection under IHL when they are in hands of the party to the conflict or the enemies. But there must be one of these conditions that meet, one of these conditions must meet in order to say that they have special protection. They have special protection of these civilians are not nationals of this enemy state, like for example the Palestinian people who are not nationals of the enemy state, which is Israel. So they have to enjoy the general protection of IHL, and they have another specific kind of protection as people under the belligerent occupation according to this condition, like or this case. We are not national of the enemy state, so we have general protection, and we have the second type of protection, which is the specific protection or private protection as persons under the occupation, or when the people are not nationals of allied to this enemy state, and also when these civilians are not nationals of a neutral state, I mean non-belligerent state like the Switzerland. Anyway, we don't have to look at the deep illustration of these conditions, but we have to focus on the first one, which is the nationals of the persons who are not nationals of the enemy state, like the Palestinian who have the special protection. Anyway, the protected civilians are entitled to respect for their lives, their dignity, their personal rights, and political, religious, and other convictions. Anyway, they must not be subjected to torture, cruel, degrading treatment, or corporal punishment, and must be protected against all acts of violence and reprisals. One more thing, civilians are particularly at risk when they are in territory occupied by the army of the belligerent power, or when they are detained for reasons related to the armed conflict. And actually this applies to the Palestinian situation, so we have to keep this in mind. So as we mentioned here, or as mentioned here, in occupied territory, the occupying power has a particular obligation to provide them with food, the medical supplies for protected civilians. It may that someone say that the Israel is not occupying the Gaza Strip since they do not exist within the Gaza Strip, and this is incorrect according to international law and the Hague regulations, because according to the Hague regulations, the occupations means that the occupying state, they have control on the aerial space and on the lands of the occupied state. Since Israel besieges the Gaza Strip, then in this case we still under the occupation. So the Israel as occupying state has a particular obligation to provide the Gaza Strip with the food and the medical supplies. So this is regarding the first kind of the persons who are protected under the IHL in times of the international armed conflict. The second kind of people who are under the protection of IHL during the international armed conflict, the combatant. But if we say the combatant and stop, then this will be incorrect, since the combatant in general, they are not protected under the IHL. Why? Because they are the legitimate target of the IHL. But the combatant or the combat, it means the person or the combatant who is no longer able to fight because he surrendered himself, because he is wounded, because he is prisoner of war. Then these people mustn't be protected under the IHL. They have special protection since they are not taking part in hostilities anymore. So the combatant or the combat are protected under IHL. What about the combatant who are taking part in hostilities currently? These persons mustn't be protected generally, but they have only to be protected against only the attacks that may lead to superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This kind of suffering or this kind of injuries mustn't be conducted against the combatant. I mean, you can kill the combatant of the enemy, but you do not have to use things that may lead to superfluous injury or any unnecessary suffering. So combatants aren't protected under the effects of hostilities in general. They are not protected, but they are protected against these things. I mean, the superfluous or the unnecessary suffering. The combat person who is not able to pursue fighting is protected under the IHL. So the combatant is a person who is not generally protected under IHL. If he is in hands of the enemy, then in this case he will be he will